Hi, I'm Eric Hartman, Director of Advocacy with the Choroideremia Research Foundation, and I'm here today to try and help our CRF patients and families gain a better understanding of genetic testing and the importance of genetic counseling. We are very, very lucky to have a good friend of the CRF, Meghan DeBenedictis, who is an ophthalmologic genetic counselor. She has extensive experience in genetic testing, genetic research, and genetic counseling. Meghan, you have been a friend of the association for many years, and it was funny in doing a bit of research on you, I actually came across a picture of you and our past president, Chris Moen, who both of you were in the USA Today for a presentation on telling the stories of genetic testing with Spark Therapeutics. So you and I have worked together both with the American group, and I'm going to forget the acronyms, but there's the American Genetics Group, the European Genetics Group, and because of all of my contact with you, I actually, in 2019, addressed the UK EGG, their study group for the British Isles. So folks, it's really important that we have genetic testing, and Meghan's going to be able to speak to us a bit more about that. But as everyone knows that has been around the foundation for a long time, you've heard that there are a lot of patients that were originally diagnosed and their families were diagnosed as having retinitis pigmentosa or some other inherited retinal disease. And it wasn't until genetic testing confirmation was received that they realized they had CHM. And for those of you who are new, this is another reason why you need to make sure you get genetically tested so you can also make sure you're giving that confirmation to your family. So welcome, Meghan.
Thank you, Eric. I'm so pleased to be here and to be a part of your foundation. The work that you guys are doing is absolutely incredible. I'm honored, I'm humbled to be talking with you today and to present some information on genetics. So to that end, I think, genetics is something that can oftentimes be a little bit scary for people. So I do have a PowerPoint that I will sort of walk through some of this information with all of you who are listening. Let me just start the slideshow. And I will do my best to be descriptive for those of you who are unable to see or read the content on the slides or see the pictures. I will do my best. So again, we want to talk about understanding the genetics of choroideremia. And genetics, honestly, it does not have to be scary or confusing or uncertain, frustrating, intimidating. These are verbs and adjectives that I've heard other people describe when they hear the term genetics or genetic disease. This oftentimes is our emotions and thoughts that people have when it comes to this idea. So let's break it down a little bit and try to get everyone on the same page and have a better understanding of what DNA and genetics actually is and how it contributes to disease and why it's important for you and your family. So DNA has a long name to it, which is why we call it DNA and not by the full name, which is deoxyribonucleic acid. And DNA is really what carries the genetic instructions and tells our bodies how to grow, develop, and function properly. Our DNA has its own alphabet, and it's made up of 4 letters, A, G, T, and C. And it's the sequence of those letters that again provides the body's instructions. If we think about our genetic information, it is packaged, our DNA is packaged along these structures called chromosomes. And if we were to take one cell and look at it underneath a microscope, we should all have 23 pairs of chromosomes. We get 1 copy of each pair from our moms and 1 copy of each pair from our dads. And the picture on the current slide is showing an egg cell and a sperm cell with half of that genetic information coming together and forming, the full 23 pairs or 46 total chromosomes for a baby. So again, these chromosomes, it's basically our DNA packaged together. Again, we get one copy of each pair from mom, one copy of each pair from dad. And in choroideremia specifically, the reason this is important is because of the last pair of chromosomes. The last pair of chromosomes are the chromosomes that determine biological sex or gender. Females typically are supposed to have 2 X chromosomes, whereas males have an X chromosome they get from their moms and a Y chromosome they get from their dads. So again, thinking about our genes specifically, as I've already mentioned, a gene is basically just a piece or a segment of our DNA. And a gene encodes a protein, and it's the protein that actually goes and does the various jobs within the body. Humans have over 22,000 genes, and with choroideremia specifically, this is a diagnosis where there is one gene that causes choroideremia, which is the CHM gene. And the CHM gene is located on the X chromosome. So again, if you imagine one skin cell and you look at it underneath a microscope, you're going to see all these sort of wormy looking structures that are called the chromosomes. And that last pair, the X and the Y, those are what a male would have, the X chromosome from the mom, the Y chromosome from the dad. The CHM gene produces a protein called REP1. And when the REP1 gene or protein, isn't working the way that it should, that is what causes the cells in the retina to prematurely die off or degenerate, which is then what leads to the progressive vision loss that is characteristic of choroideremia. So because the CHM gene is located and lives on the X chromosome, this is why we typically see that males are affected, whereas females can be carriers. So here I have a slide that has a picture showing a man, so the dad having his X chromosome and his Y chromosome, and a mom having her 2 X chromosomes. One of those X chromosomes I have as red, and the reason I have it as red is because that is the X chromosome that is indicating the mutation in the choroideremia gene. It's the choroideremia gene copy on that X chromosome that isn't working the way that it should. If a mother is a carrier for a red X that has a non-working choroideremia gene copy, there it would be a 50-50 chance of passing on either her healthy X or her red non-working X to any child. Dad then would contribute either his X or his Y. So if dad contributes his X and mom contributes her healthy X, that would be a daughter that would be unaffected and not a carrier for choroideremia. However, if dad passes on his Y and mom passes on her non-working X, that red X that has the non-working choroideremia gene, that would be a son who would be affected with choroideremia. So depending on the combination of those chromosomes, whether it's an X or a Y from dad, and the healthy X versus the unhealthy X from the mom, that is going to dictate A, the gender of that child, and B, whether or not that child would be affected or a carrier of choroideremia. This is another picture depicting a man who is affected with choroideremia. So he has that red X, that non-working choroideremia gene copy, and then the Y chromosome that is making him male. When he has children, he's going to automatically pass on that red X, that X copy, that X choroideremia gene copy that's not working to all of his daughters, because that is what is going to make any child of his female. However, he's going to pass on a Y chromosome to any sons of his. So if a man is affected with choroideremia, all of his daughters will automatically be considered carriers, whereas any son of his will not be a carrier, not be affected with the condition. So we do have variations within our DNA. We all carry changes within our genes. That's what makes us all unique in who we are. Many DNA changes or variations are perfectly benign. They don't cause disease or any type of genetic condition. Some DNA changes or variations, though, do affect the function of a protein, and they make that gene not work. They make that protein not work. Sometimes we refer to these types of changes as mutations. And then there are also some changes that we find when we look at somebody's DNA that we're not really sure what that change is. We don't know if it's a disease-causing change or a benign change, and it's a change that we classify as uncertain. As of this year, 2021, there are over 300 variants that have been described in the choroideremia gene that we believe are causative of disease. So this is a picture of the minions. For those of you who are familiar with the minions, you have your yellow minion who's, happy, healthy, doing his job the way that he should. And if there is a spelling error or a harmful or a mutation type of change in that gene, that minion is going to become the mutant minion, if you will, and not work the way that it should and go all havoc and not perform the way that it is supposed to. So again, some changes in the spelling of a gene do lead to non-working copies of a gene and protein, and that is what is leading to disease. So the gene itself does not cause disease, it's the spelling error within the DNA sequence of that gene that is what is causing disease. So genetic testing. Basically, genetic testing analyzes the DNA to determine if we can find the underlying spelling change that would be predisposing to an inherited condition. For CHM specifically, this might involve looking at only the CHM gene, or it might involve looking at all of the currently known retinal dystrophy associated genes. So genetic testing can come in many different flavors and forms. There's a lot of different types of genetic tests. There's a lot of different labs that offer genetic testing. Not all genetic testing is created equal, but it is really important that everyone get genetic testing. Having a genetic or molecular diagnosis is the only way to know with as close to 100% as we can ever be in medicine that somebody really does have choroideremia as the correct diagnosis. As Eric mentioned in his introduction, there are many other different types of inherited retinal dystrophies or degenerations that can sometimes mimic or resemble choroideremia. So sometimes patients can get, not that they're misdiagnosed, not that they don't have a retinal dystrophy, but the specific type of retinal dystrophy might be hard to differentiate based off of a clinical examination alone. This is where genetic testing comes into play. A genetic test result might also be necessary for those of you who may be interested in participating in clinical trials, or if potential therapeutic developments or treatments become available, there may be a requirement or helpful to have a positive genetic test result so we know exactly what it is you have so we can best treat it. Having a genetic diagnosis also allows for recurrence risk for family members. Again, thinking back to choroideremia being an X-linked condition, if we know the specific mutation that we're looking for, we can easily test other people in the family who may be at risk of also being affected, or females who may want to know whether or not they're a carrier for their own reproductive risk purposes. Genetic testing in the proband, what we call basically the first person in the family to be affected, is really beneficial so we know exactly how to counsel patients regarding risk for disease. Genetic testing can be obtained either through a blood or a saliva sample, and it's something that you can do by talking to your doctor. Some ophthalmologists and optometrists are happy to order genetic testing for their patients. Others may refer and prefer to have a genetic counselor involved with the ordering of the genetic testing. So what is genetic counseling? Genetic counseling is really a process of helping patients understand and adapt to the genetic contributions to disease. As a genetic counselor, we assess risk. We interpret and obtain physical, personal, and medical family histories. We find medical and social services. So if you have not had local evaluation, or if you're interested in support group information, genetic counselors are well equipped to refer you to those types of resources. We also can provide emotional support and help patients understand all of the ins and outs of a genetic testing process and understand the results of that testing. We can also facilitate informed decision-making and provide education, so helping patients understand how a particular genetic condition is working and causing disease within a family. So again, genetic counselors, we can help determine which test. I mentioned earlier, genetic testing can be complicated. There's a lot of options out there. Genetic counselors are really the best ones to determine which test might be the most appropriate test for you or your family. They can address any questions or concerns that you might have about the process of testing. How much does it cost? Will insurance cover it? Are there free testing options available? What about research? Genetic counselors can help with all of that. They can also explain the results to you in a way that hopefully you would understand and make sense of for you and for your family, and facilitate that family member testing for those who are interested. Again, we can refer to resources and offer support and understanding. So in conclusion, genetics does not have to be scary, confusing, uncertain, frustrating, or intimidating. Rather, genetics can be empowering, it can be understood, it can be certain, it can be encouraging, it can be meaningful. And the Choroideremia Research Foundation is here for you. Thank you.
Well, Megan, thank you very much. That's an incredibly informative presentation. I really, I want to reiterate the importance of genetic counselors, because for many of us as patients or as family members, the first time we hear the word choroideremia or blindness, we can suddenly, our mind just goes flying away and we're not hearing what the doctor is saying. And in many cases, the doctors are so busy that, you know, you need more time to understand and absorb it. And that's where getting genetic counseling can be so incredibly important. And it's not that it's always there. There can also be, and you may be able to speak to this, depending on some of the testing programs, there are teleconferencing with patients, and that can be very important. I know here in Louisiana, I was amazed to find out there were only 4 geneticists in Louisiana, and I think that equal number of genetic counselors. So depending on where you live, it could be very difficult, but there are programs currently, like the FFB has a free testing program that also affords genetic counseling. And that could be a big, big help. When you were talking about the inheritance, one of the things I think that's incredibly important is all of our patients and potential carriers should be genetically identified. Our foundation is working with the NEI to develop a very robust natural history study of female patients, because we know that female carriers are patients. They develop night blindness and potentially other diseases, but we really don't know how that disease plays out. And in order to do that, we are going to need to make sure that these carriers are in fact choroideremia patients. So that's important. But I was wondering if you could talk, if you want to explain a little bit. It's my general understanding with a female, when the 2 X chromosomes come together, the body amazingly is able to isolate generally if there is one errored or the mutant X, that they will actually, that's the one they choose to shut down. Because in all females, I think the process is called lionization, where one of the X chromosomes is basically put almost permanently inactive, though we now know, given the symptoms of CHM patients, that some of that may not be as permanent as the patient gets older. Is that a correct understanding?
Yeah, Eric, that is. And the other thing so sometimes we'll also call it skewed X inactivation. So to your point, you know, normally one of the X's sort of becomes quote unquote inactive, so to speak. You know, the body really only needs the genetic information from one copy of that X chromosome for, you know, in many, you know, instances. However, what can sometimes happen is that either in some cells or in all of the cells, you know, depending on, you know, how that biological process works, sometimes the X that has the choroideremia mutation might not be the X copy that becomes inactive. It might be the copy that is more active. And so we can call that skewed X inactivation, where sometimes, to your point, females may exhibit, you know, some degree of evidence of disease, whether that's having features seen just based on eye exam, but they're asymptomatic, so they don't necessarily have, you know, night blindness or other, you know, symptoms of the condition. Sometimes there can be features seen based off of that fundus examination. And in some instances, females do actually have, you know, pretty significant symptoms from the disease itself. So yeah, it's definitely important to, you know, identify those who may require services. And as you were talking, you know, as we continue to understands the natural history of this disease for both men and for women who are carriers of this, the more that we test, the more we identify, the more information we're going to have, the better we're going to be able to understand how all of this works.
Absolutely. And to your point, we do have patients, female patients, that have full-blown CHM effects and symptoms. And that's been something that was not as much talked about in all of the medical research papers, but it is becoming a bit more. And that's something that we, as a foundation for our global community, we want to be able to better understand that, because besides gene therapies, there are new therapies coming out, which are the mRNA. And for patients that don't know what that is, mRNA is basically the blueprint that is created to create a protein from DNA. And when that is skewed, say for CHM, the mRNA is errored and we don't get the Rep1 protein created. So there are new therapies coming that could target that specific mutation's errored mRNA and create the correct one, which could be, it won't correct the disease, but it will, it won't genetically correct it, but it will prevent the effects of it by increasing the production of the proper protein that's missing, the Rep1. Can you talk a bit more about, and I know it's, I'm sure, up to the families, but do you have any recommendations when you have children that are diagnosed? At what age is it? Do you find it's up to the family, or do you find earlier is better?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and one where I think, honestly, we probably need to do, some sort of studies on, patient preferences, thoughts, viewpoints, and outcomes of this. Historically, in the field of genetics, so not thinking just about choroideremia, but thinking about all genetic disease, the recommendation was not to test asymptomatic minors for genetic conditions for which there was no treatment or prevention. However, it's been interesting as I've, practiced in this field for, over 10 years, I have talked to so many families who have said, I realize there's nothing we can necessarily do about it, but if I know that, my son, who is currently 2 years old, is going to be affected and have these symptoms, I would rather help guide them towards different interests, or guide them, start preparing them and getting some resources in place so that when those symptoms present themselves, we're well equipped and adjusted and able to handle that. So I, certainly am happy to order genetic testing on asymptomatic minors, but it's something that I have a pretty lengthy discussion with the parents and the family, and making sure that everybody understands, sort of the risks, benefits, limitations of that testing. And, I'm not just going to go ordering testing on everyone. It's really part of the genetic counseling process, that we understand that we're doing the right test for the right patient at the right time in that patient's life. And that's part of why genetic counseling also is so important. There's things that I've brought up to families through that counseling process for asymptomatic children, different things that I've brought up about insurance discrimination, things like that, life insurance policies, things that, the average person isn't necessarily thinking about on a day-to-day basis. But parents have certainly appreciated having the opportunity to have all of that discussed, have those different viewpoints, brought up as they think about testing their kids. The other thing I mentioned, Eric, earlier we were talking about, even carriers, should get tested. Certainly if you have a boy or, a man who's diagnosed for choroideremia and he's the first person in the family, there is no family history of it, mom didn't have an affected dad, mom didn't have affected brothers. The reason why we always encourage, the mom to have testing is there's always the potential that the choroideremia gene mutation was a brand new spontaneous change that just happened in that person and didn't actually come from the mom. That's important because that would affect recurrence risks, for any other siblings of that initial patient. So we definitely want to, encourage, obviously if mom has a strong family history, then we can assume that she's a carrier, if her son's affected. But if there's no family history of the disease and someone is born for the first time and affected, we definitely want to make sure that mom has carrier testing to know whether or not this truly did come from the X chromosome that was in her egg cell versus was this something that was maybe a brand new spontaneous thing that just happened in the patient.
Speaking of that, could there have been a spontaneous mutation that was initiated within the mother and without having a family history, and now she's a carrier of that disease and then could give it to the son?
Yep,
okay.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, that's fascinating. Can you possibly speak to, I know it's been for many older doctors, genetic testing used to be very expensive and cumbersome, and the cost has definitely come down. And many of these testing agencies or companies, if one patient one of the family gets the confirmed diagnosis, there are many of these companies that will have a much reduced testing cost for additional family members because they're going in, they know right where to look, and they can do it quickly. And can you talk about how families can advocate to get that done if they find resistance from their physician, or whether they can initiate that themselves with the testing companies?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good, I'm glad you brought that up because that's something that does come up quite a bit. The whole goal of doing genetic testing is to identify the specific spelling error, that specific, disease causing variation or mutation that is, causing disease. Once we know what that variation is, let's say at the 1,200 second letter of the CHM gene, there's supposed to be a C and instead we find a T. We know exactly where to hone in and look, as you just mentioned, for anybody else in the family. We don't need to look at the entire choroideremia gene. We don't need to look at all of the other retinal dystrophy genes. We just need to hone into that one spot and look to see, which letter is there. So it does make genetic testing for family members very easy, very straightforward. And to your point, it is a much less expensive test compared to doing full gene sequencing or a full retinal dystrophy panel. I think, the important thing for patients to know and be aware of in order to get that done, it's called targeted variant analysis or familial variant analysis. Depending on the genetic testing lab, they may have, slightly different term for it. But basically, it's targeted testing. That's all you need. You don't need to do, full gene or full panel testing. And, once you know what you're looking for. For doctors that are resistant, patients can always reach out and request to meet with a genetic counselor. In order to have a genetic testing done, you do have to have an ordering physician. So you can't just call up a genetic testing lab and say, hey, I want my sample tested. The lab would tell you that you need, to meet with a genetic counselor or meet with a physician in order for that test to get ordered for you. But you can certainly always make an appointment with a genetic counselor. You don't necessarily need your eye doctor to be the one who's ordering that test. You can always reach out and talk to a genetic counselor, and genetic counselors are definitely going to make sure that you're getting the right test and getting that targeted testing in the event that it's already a known mutation in the family.
And the genetic counselors serve such a very, very important point there. And as you had mentioned earlier, it's through your associates that do this work that you can tell them about the foundation, where they can suddenly get support that is targeted to them. We had a patient who was thought to have had RP, got tested. His mom got tested to reconfirm that it was CHM, and they had 48 living relatives that were living with an RP diagnosis.
Wow.
So it can make a big difference in a family. So
Huge
it's very
difference.
important also. And it's important to reach out to your relatives once you get a diagnosis to let them know that this is potentially part of the family genetics, because it can be important for them. And when you talk about younger patients. We now know it's incredibly important for young CHM patients, especially the males, to wear sunglasses at almost any time they're outside, just to help protect their eyes. And I grew up not even knowing it. I didn't wear sunglasses until I thought it was cool enough to go on spring break in Florida, but which fully explains a lot about me at this point. But no, I think it's incredibly important. One of the other things, and this has happened to several people that had a clinical diagnosis of choroideremia, and they were part of our foundation. When they did get tested, it turned out they had something else.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case where they've had a targeted test for CHM and it's come up negative, what is their next move? I mean, I'm assuming a genetic counseling or counselor would advise a full panel
Mm-hmm.
test at that point of inherited retinal diseases.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely where, again, for those instances, you would absolutely want to meet with a genetic counselor, because that genetic counselor is going to get literally every bit of information and determine what the next best move is going to be. They'll look at, the other thing I want to bring up is patients, you always want to get a copy of that genetic test report. If you have genetic testing done, that genetic test report, you are entitled to that result. You are entitled to that piece of paper that shows exactly what your test result is. And that is something that you, to Eric's point, can absolutely share with your family members. That's how we know what to test other people in the family for, is that official lab report. So please make sure that you get that from your physicians who may order testing on you. That 100% belongs to you. That is your test result. And I totally lost my train of thought, and I apologize. But I think what we were talking about is, the genetic counselor would be able to look at, okay, what was this test that you had done? Was it really just the choroideremia gene? Was it looking at the whole gene? Was it looking at part of the gene only? Get the family history, get the medical history, and they would be the ones, who would best determine what next steps, what next testing would be the most appropriate.
That's so very, very true. One thing, because we're speaking to a global audience here, and excuse me, I know your experience is here in the US, but you deal with a lot of other genetic counselors with the international communities, and I know different countries have different levels of genetic testing. Do you, in all those cases, I guess the easiest way is to speak to your doctors first. Mm-hmm. I know in France and in England, they're beginning to do it more as a standard of practice to get it tested. But, and even here in the United States, it's a question of going to the doctor to get that request in. And I know internationally that getting tests, if there aren't any, we've had patients in Croatia and other countries where they couldn't get the testing. The easiest one to ship is saliva versus blood. It's a much easier way of getting tested. So our patients should, when they can, if they are working on an international basis, try and look for the testing that's done with saliva, because it's so much easier to handle.
Yeah, it's certainly a lot easier. You don't need someone, you don't need a blood draw appointment or anything like that. It's very easy, especially, since the coronavirus pandemic, we've been doing almost all saliva kits just to prevent patients from needing to go in, for an extra visit to the hospital to get a blood draw. So yeah, saliva is very feasible. As long as people follow the instructions, it's pretty straightforward. And the other thing, I get asked a lot, which is more accurate, saliva or blood? Well, as long as you follow those instructions, the saliva is going to work just fine. And all genetic testing labs are going to do a quality control check. And if there's any problem with that saliva sample whatsoever, if the lab does not think that saliva sample is going to give the best type of result or, affect the type, the quality of the sample, the quality of the DNA, that lab is going to notify the ordering provider. They're going to notify the patient and say, hey, this is not an ideal specimen. We need a second sample. So, I think when I explain that to patients, they feel more reassured that a lab isn't just going to use a subpar, sample to try to do their testing.
Do you find that genetic counseling is a short-term, one-time thing, or can patients within where you work be able to return to you with questions?
Oh yeah, it's funny that you asked that because I tell patients all the time, often I feel like what I experience is I meet with a patient, I order their test, I go over the results with them once I receive the results, and then that's kind of it. My job is kind of done. I've done what I've needed to do for that patient or that family. But what I love is when patients do follow up with me. I love to hear back from them. I love it when I get a call from a family member, of that patient. I had a patient, just a couple of weeks ago who I met with in person who said, we got to come back here every 6 months. Do you think we can meet with you too every 6 months? And I was like, yes, absolutely. I don't know how much more information I'll be able to necessarily share with them, but I love meeting with patients over time and being able to continue to be part of their journey and also be able to continue to make sure that they have the resources they need. A genetic diagnosis such as choroideremia, it's not a stationary thing, it's a linear thing. And the needs of a patient, the needs of a family do continue to change and evolve over time. There's new circumstances that come up for patients and for families. And, I love to be part of those conversations and being able to support families in that way.
Well, it's certainly incredibly important to us. And that's one of the reasons our foundation, through our legislative advocacy, has been working to make sure that genetic counseling is considered part of the standard of practice, because it makes such a big difference. I got my genetic testing emailed to me, and it was just well, you know what a report looks like, and there was no layman's explanation, and I was literally waiting for it, and the doctor finally called me back to explain it, and I was checking out of a grocery. And I'd waited a week and a half for this guy to call me back. And I was like, I'm trying to check out. And I'm like, what, a splice site mutation? What? That's why it's so incredibly, I didn't have the genetic counseling, which again could explain a lot. But Meghan, I want to thank you for your time and the work that you guys do. We as a foundation, the CRF is going to continue to reach out. We want to attend the next American gathering of the Ophthalmologic Genetics Study Club, as it's called here in the United States. And we look forward to working with you guys. Anything that we can do on our end to help you, or if you come up with any ideas of how we can get our word spread as a resource for genetic counselors nationally and internationally, just drop us a line. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. That means a lot. I really appreciate it. And again, I am so grateful for all that this organization foundation is doing for patients. It's so nice when I have a patient with a particular genetic condition that I can refer them to a specific foundation, such as yours, that is very tailored to that unique diagnosis, because there are differences in all of these retinal diseases. And I think people can certainly learn a lot from some of the more generic, generalized, blindness associations, but yours specifically has done just such tremendous work over the years. It is so valuable for patients with this disorder.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think when we get together again, hopefully after all the pandemic is gone, being able to get together in person, it makes a huge difference.
It
when
really
you
does.
Can meet with other patients in a community, you realize you're no longer alone. You realize you don't need to learn alone. And I definitely learned from the experience of the men and women that have gone before me. So it's incredibly important. Well, thank you again. And again, to the CHM community, if you haven't been genetically tested, speak with your ophthalmologist and request it, and make sure you ask to speak to a genetic counselor, because you're going to get a lot more information. And I think it will help you in the long run. So thanks again. And we look forward to the next webinar here at the CRF. Thanks again, Meghan.
Thank you, Eric. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.